So today is April the 2nd, 2021, and is it still 1 o'clock or have we passed the start time?
1:15.
Okay, not too bad. And I'm here with William Schoonover. So where would you like to begin?
Well, the questions you sent to me, the first one was where did I grow up? Where did I grow up? I grew up in Bealington, which is a town about 15 miles from Elkins. My father was a fireman on the Bealington-Elkins local turn, he worked for the B&O. And that's why we settled in the little town of Bealington. And I lived there, except from going to school, I lived there until I was about 19 years old. So, see if I can get some of this other stuff out that I have. One of the things that happened to me, I always liked trains. When Dad would come into the yard or anything there in Bealington, we would go down and pick him up at night and bring him home. And they might have a little bit of work left to do when we got down there. My mother would take us down and we'd usually sit in the car and wait for him to quit. One time, when I was approximately 3 or 4 years old, I asked Dad if I could ride the engine. And he said yes, and he helped me get up on the engine. I got up and it was a steam engine, and the engineer, who was a good friend of the family, his name was Russ Good, said, hand that boy over here and let me show him how to run an engine. So I sat on the engineer's lap, and we were going around the yard doing some switching. And before long, late at night, for me, my head drifted back on his chest, and I was sound asleep on the engineer's lap while he was doing all the work. And he told my dad, he said, that guy's going to make an engineer before long. And I guess the story of that got around and everything. And I had a few jobs before I went to work for the railroad. I worked as a welder. I worked as an auto mechanic. I was getting laid off trying to get a job. I had a family at the time. I hired out on the railroad in Parkersburg, West Virginia, on the track. I was the trackman first, and they were going to have a rail gang come in and put down new rail, and they needed people to put in crossings. And you had to make a cut on each side of the crossing, put in the new rail, and then you put down new crossing boards and everything. And it was a rough job. You stayed right with it all day long. Well, I think I hired out with 10 guys for that crossing gang, and by the time the first week was over, we were down to about 5 of us. They had old trackmen in there with us, but about 5 of the new guys had quit. I worked that for about a month. Then the Eastern Regional Rail Gang came in, and they laid all of us off that was on the crossing gang, and we went to work for the Eastern Regional Rail Gang. And I worked probably about a month on that. And my dad had talked to the road foreman of engines, and he told him that I was working on the railroad. Mr. Marshall asked if I would be interested in becoming a fireman or an engineer, and I had to go take a test. And I passed the test, and they assigned me to the job as a hostler in Cowan, West Virginia, working from 11 to 7 in the morning. And I worked that job for the first 3 years of my railroad career. They didn't hire anybody, and I was the youngest person, and nobody wanted to work the midnight turn account. They started hiring people under me, and I got released from that job, and I was able to take a turn as a fireman on a turn that went from Grafton to Cowan. And I worked it for about 2 months. After that 2 months, I was sent to engineers training school in Cumberland, Maryland. You were up there for, I believe, 3 months. And after that 3 months, you had a 6 month where you were out working the turns on your subdivision. The engineers you would be with an engineer, and he would teach you the railroad, the basic functions of what you were supposed to do here and there, teach you how to handle the train and what you had to do, put the brakes on at a certain time and everything. And it was a lot to learn, and they told us that it would be equal to 3 years in college in 9 months. And you had tests every week that you had to take and pass. You had to have a road foreman of engines ride with you every 2 weeks, and he would tell you how you were doing and write a report on you. And you just were constantly being scrutinized, how you were doing and everything else. When the day after I finished taking my final test to become a promoted engineer, I took a turn in Grafton as a fireman, working a turn from Grafton to Cowan. That day, the phone rang for me to go to work, and they told me that I was going to be the engineer because the engineer had laid off. They didn't have anybody on the extra board to take care of the turn. So the minute that I got out of training is the minute that I started the job as an engineer. I made one round trip to Cowan as an engineer. Was very nervous. Didn't have anybody to look over and say, what do I do now? And when I got back to Grafton, I talked to some people, and they said, well, you made it up and back, that's the main thing. The next trip, my engineer was back. I knew him, and he said, well, how'd you do? He said, I knew you could do the job. I had to go shopping with my wife. So that's how it all started. So you wanted to know what people in my family worked on the railroad. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a conductor. He started out as a brakeman on the Dry Fork Railroad. The Dry Fork Railroad was basically a log railroad, but it hauled freight too, and it was over around Hamilton, Hendricks, went up to the town of Dry Fork. It went up the Dry Fork River. He either got laid off or quit that job, but then he went to work for the West Virginia Coal and Coke Railroad. He lived in Elkins, and he was a conductor, and they would, at times they left out of Elkins and went all the way to Charleston. And they hauled freight, they hauled coal. There was some passenger trains. I don't know if he ever worked one or not, but there were passenger trains. And my grandmother and my mother told me that there were times that he had a chest that he took with him, and he would put enough food for maybe a week. and he would be on the caboose. He was able to fix meals. The cabooses had stoves in them, and they kept ice on the caboose to keep stuff cold. Some of the food that my grandmother sent with him was canned. She had home canned the food, and he would have enough meals for him that he could go from Elkins to Charleston and back. He got my father an interview to become a fireman on the B&O Railroad right after World War II. And Dad hired out shortly after World War II and as a fireman, and my father worked 41 years as a fireman and an engineer on the railroad. I hired out and I worked 33 years on the railroad. Now that's the whole, I guess I would be the third generation railroader. We all had different things happen to us on the railroad. It was, when I started out, it was we had a 5-man crew. You had an engineer and a fireman, a head brakeman, a flagman, and a conductor. When I retired, we were down to a 2-man crew. You had an engineer and a conductor. That was a lot of the changes that were made in the equipment and the jobs that we did. If you were going to have to work a mine, before I retired, if you had to work a mine, they had what they called a utility band that drove around in a pickup truck to assist the conductor with what he had to do to place cars in the mine and stuff like that. Now, do you have any questions for me now?
Not yet.
All right. One of the questions that you wrote for me to answer, did I think the job was dangerous? Yes. You worked 12 hours a day. Sometimes it was from 6 at night till 6 in the morning. And you had to be alert and awake and constant vigilant to what was going on around you. There were landslides. I remember on 2 occasions bridges burned. People left switches open. Train wrecks, at one of the train wrecks that I had and was in, a trackman left a switch open, and we went into the siding running 25 miles an hour and hit the Eastern Regional Rail Gang camp cars. That happened at Frenchton, West Virginia, and we were the whole head-end crew. I was the engineer, had a lady fireman, and the head brakeman, and all of us were off work at least 9 months. I had a hurt knee, which kept me off. The fireman had hurt her back. The conductor he ended up being one of the conductors, but the head brakeman had injuries on him that kept him off. One of the bridges that burned, the crew that was on the train came out of a tunnel, and they had about 100 feet till they went out onto a bridge, and the bridge was on fire. And it had been on fire for a good while. The engines made it from one end of the bridge to the other end, and then everything came to a halt, but they were just off the bridge with the engines. I was the engineer that had to take the wreck train up to that bridge and we re-railed the engines, and then other crews came and did the work that we were doing. They rebuilt the bridge, and within 3 weeks' time, we had trains running back over the bridge. Let's see what else. I ran a special train one time I was the engineer from Belington to Elkins, but it was a special passenger train out of Grafton. It was run during the Grafton Heritage Festival in 1984. And it consisted of 2 engines and about 14 or 15, I'm not sure exactly of the number of passenger cars that were on it, but the passenger cars were full. They had advertised, and there were people from all over the eastern United States that rode the train. I got on at Belington, pulled ahead, and we went to Elkins. Then we had to cut the engines off and run around the train and come back, take it back to Belington. And it was 2 days that I did that. In your film, you might see pictures of me with the engines. That was part of the grandiose things that I got to do, and it was fun. It was showed that they had some faith in me, and all the road foremen of engines and train masters from the area rode the train, and they said I did a fine job. Let's see what else is here. You want to know what the biggest change was? The biggest change that really concerned an engineer was the amount of time that we actually were trained. From the time that I went to the training to be an engineer, we had people that came out of the school in less than 6 weeks that we had to train every day for at least 6 or 8 months, but they were out of the school in 6 weeks, and they had the new equipment. We had learned on the old equipment. The equipment changed greatly. The people that, when I started out, we ran the old F7s, which was a passenger type locomotive, Jeep 7s, Jeep 9s. Every now and then we'd have a Jeep 30 or a Jeep 38 on the local turns around. When I retired, we went all the way up to, we had the General Electric AC 4400 locomotives, which were highly computerized locomotives. Where we worked out of Grafton, when we got the AC 4400s, they brought 2 of the engines in. The engine numbers were number 1 and number 2. And they parked them on a side track down there at Grafton. We got up on them and looked them all over. A road foreman and an instructor out of Cumberland would come over when you were ready to go to work. The first thing you did, you went over and got up on those engines and looked them all over. We said, here is the engine. The engines cost about $1.5 million a piece. And that was our 30-minute class sitting on the engines in Grafton, West Virginia, was all the instructions that we had on these engines. Plus they gave us an operator's manual to read and familiarize yourself with it. Then eventually within the next 2 weeks' time, everybody on our subdivision was running these engines from Grafton to Cowan. And it was a dramatic change from going to looking at gauges on an engine and having your independent brake, your automatic brake for the train and everything, and looking at an old style control stand to where you were looking at 2 computer screens, and they took your ability to use your left hand to work all the brakes and made it over to where you had to learn to use your right hand for all the brakes and the throttle and everything else. And it was a very big change. And that was about 10 years before I retired. By the time I was retired, we had even more changes in those engines. Some of them, you started out with some of the engines were 1,500 horsepower. By the time I retired, we had engines that were 6,000 horsepower. And it was very different in how you handled everything and did everything. We went from 80 car trains to 160 to 200 car trains in the mountains of West Virginia. You might, with those 80 car trains, you might have 4 engines. With the 160 car trains, you might have 2 engines. And it was a great deal of change to learn how to do everything. That's about all that I can. The job was 12 hours a day. When I hired out, they had regular turns. You had a regular turn that went to work. I had a regular turn after I was promoted to an engineer. Went to work at 6 o'clock at night and worked till 6 in the morning. It went from Grafton to Cowan one day. You took 8 hours off, and it worked from Cowan to Grafton the next day. You took empties up and you brought loads back. Then they decided that the regular turns weren't working out the way that they wanted them to, and they took us and made pool turns. A pool turn is you have a pool of engineers. There might have been, I think the most that we ever had in our pool was 10 or 12 turns as an engineer. They would call you anytime they wanted you. Might be 1 o'clock in the morning, it might be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you might be working the head end of a turn, or you might be working a mine run that was the helper of a turn. And it was a great deal of change. We had, before that, we had regular crews. We worked with the same men day in and day out, and they became almost like family. You worked with them. You knew how they talked to you on the radio. You knew what was going on. And when they went to pool turns, you might work with the same crew 2 days in a row, or you might not work with that crew until another 2 weeks. It just depended on how the engineers had 10 or 12 turns in it. The conductors had maybe 8 crews in it. And the way that the turns worked, you went to work. The first person on the board went to work. The first person as an engineer went to work. And then it could swap out and change every day. And it was a big change for me. I was comfortable working with the crews I was with. The whole thing with it was they just wanted to make it so that nobody was going to work at a certain time, and we weren't working with the same people. Now, what questions do you have for me?
Well, you mentioned that the people that you worked with became kind of like a family, but you actually did work with your family for a while. You were telling me earlier, and I don't think that we have it recorded yet. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
When I was a fireman and able to hold a regular turn, my father had a regular turn that went from Grafton to County. Had a regular crew with him, and I was older than the person was that was working with my father. So I got what you call bumped, which means that somebody else won the turn I had. So I was able to take the turn with my father. I ended up working with my father for 18 months. We went to work at the same time. I worked with him every day. It turned out it wasn't dad this or dad that, as a little boy was. I never called him Tom, but it was like, Mr. Schoonover, what do I do now? And hey kid, which he never did to me, but it was like working with your boss. Your father is your boss. And being in that situation, I picked his brain. I learned all that I could learn. And when they were coming out with new engines, I was the kind of, hey, I want to see how this thing does. I want to see what they've changed on the engines and everything. And when the new engines would come out, we would, somebody would usually go with us, but we usually knew what was coming out with what they called the GP engines or the SD engines. GP is a general purpose, and an SD is a specific duty. They had numbers that went with them, like a GP40 or an SD35 or an SD40. And we just learned how to do things. I would be the one that look in the books and see how to run them and everything. And he was about ready to retire when I was marked up as an engineer, and he was able to work a turn in Buchanan, and that's when I spent about 7 years on a regular turn, and I was working between Grafton and County. And occasionally I'd see him in Buchanan, wave to him or yell at him on the radio or put something. But when the last job that he had was when I went into the siding at Frenchton and had the big wreck. His last job was cleaning up the wreck that I made. So that's what it was like working with him. When I had just got out of the engineers training school, like I said before, and I had come home to visit my mom and dad. And I had my family with me, and they called my dad out because he was the last engineer qualified for the West Virginia Pittsburgh to run between between Elkins and Belington. And they needed an engineer. He told the caller that he didn't want to go. The caller said, "You have to go, Tom." So he struck a deal with the caller. He said that I was there at the house, and if they would make me the engineer, he would go as the pilot and get me qualified in 1 day's time between Belington and Elkins. So that's how I got qualified to make the second engineer that was qualified between Belington and Elkins. At that time, I might get 2 or 3 turns from Belington to Elkins every 6 months, but it was a different piece of railroad to run over, and I enjoyed it. It was my home. My home was in Belington, and it was my hometown territory, and I just enjoyed that part of it. And that's how I got to run the passenger train also. He told me, he said, "Too close to retirement, I don't want to run a passenger train for you. I'll let Bill run it." So that's another reason. I think he just wanted to quit running the train up here. But anything else?
what about we continue with the questions on the list that I gave you? Where did we leave off? Days that you thought were really special?
Well, the day running the passenger train was one of them that was really special for me. Also, over at, I was qualified to run from Clarksburg to Weston. It was called the West Virginia Pittsburgh subdivision. That was part of what I worked, that was my home subdivision. But anyhow, we had a piece of railroad that ran from Clarksburg to Weston. And they were getting ready to abandon the railroad. Hope Natural Gas ordered 2 gigantic compressors. I believe what they were. I think it was 2 giant compressors that was going to be set up outside of the town of Weston. They had to come in by rail. They were on what you call a snobble car, which had, that one had, let's see, it had, I think it had 12, it had 6 wheels on each, or it was 12 wheels on each end, and the compressor in the middle. And I was the engineer head out on an extra board, and they called me and said that we would have to take that car out there. We took the car out, had to take it through a tunnel, and they had to take a few parts off of it to get it through the tunnel, how tight it was. And we made it out there, and we didn't quite make it back to Clarksburg, but we left the engine set out there, and then they did have the crew out, and lo and behold, to me, came this letter from the railroad. It said that I had done an excellent job, and they were very proud of us, and it went into my permanent record that they were proud of the way that we had done it, and congratulated us. Another time that was very special, they were having us flood load a mine up on the. That means that when you start, your engines go in under a tipple, and then when the first car gets there, you are going at a speed of maybe 2 or 3/10 of a mile an hour, and they are dumping the coal into the car, and you never stop. You just keep going. Well, they were trying to do this job at a mine up around Morgantown on the Norfolk Southern Railroad, which we had rights over, which means that we could run over their railroad. And the crew that I was with, we got up there and got on the train and got started, and we loaded the whole train, and nobody else had ever loaded the whole train without having any trouble. And we worked at it very hard, the crew, and CSX sent a letter that the mine had told them that they were very proud, they were very gracious of the way that we had done it. And we loaded their train, and it was cheaper for us loading them that way than anybody else had done it because of the time it took. The railroad in turn gave us a certificate that we could order stuff, and it was $100 gift certificate that we could order stuff that the railroad sold. And I forget what all I got, but I got a bunch of stuff from them and enjoyed it and wore it out. Most of it was clothes. But that was 2 or 3 of the proudest days that I ever did. We got told how good we did, everything. And they were very hard to get a good job done, or you did something good for us. It was a very hard job to get any of that out of the railroad. They were very tight-lipped about everything. It was one of the things you ask is, did I like my job? The job, I'm a photographer. I have played with it for probably 40 years. Carried my camera some on the railroad, but my eyes caught some of the most beautiful territory and stuff that you ever see. You got to see the spring, where the flowers started coming up, and all along the railroad grade you'd see flowers coming up, the trees coming out. The summertime, the rivers would be pristine, and you would see all sorts of things. You can tell people were out enjoying themselves while we were working. In the fall of the year, the Lord painted such beautiful colors for us to see. And that part of the job and what you saw was very, very, very nice to see, and it made the job enjoyable. One time at night, when I was coming back from Callan, a Soviet satellite, burned up coming into the atmosphere of Earth. And it was one of the nights when the sky was just as clear as it could be, but there was no moon. And all of a sudden, just the way we were going, all this lit up, and there was burning debris coming in, and it was something to see. It was, I don't know if they were saying it to anybody else, but the people that were out there at night sure did get a fireworks display for a little while. That stuff was interesting, and it made the job to where it was a joy to be there, even though it was noisy, and it was very noisy at times. At times you were going through a tunnel and the engines would be wide open, and there'd be so much smoke in the tunnel that you couldn't see the headlight of the engine. It would be that full of smoke. And the whole thing with that, when first started out, it amazed me. And then later on, it just turned into second nature. But the scenery never did stop amazing me. You could see things. Anything else?
What about what happened when you retired? How did your retirement go?
Little story about retirement. Then I was supposed to retire on, I believe it was January 10th of 2010. And after midnight, I was going to be officially retired. A little girl from Jacksonville, Florida, that's where the callers were at that time. She called me up. I was head out on the extra board, which I had taken so I wouldn't have anything to do, basically. And I didn't think I was going to have to go to work. At about 9:45, the phone rang. And they said, "Mr. Schoonover, you're called for a turn that was going to go to work at 12:01. And I said, "I'm not going to be there." And she said, "Well, you do know that you're refusing call and you will have an investigation due to your absence." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I realize that, but I'm going to do something that you've never had done to you. I am going to say I quit." And she went, you're right, I haven't had anything like that done to me before, but I said, I'm retiring at 12:01 a.m. And she got the chuckle out of it and everything else. Well, the next day I went down, they were having a party like for us. My brother and my sister brought my father down to Grafton, and he was there when I retired. And then with retirement, everybody said, oh, you're going to miss it, you're going to miss it. It's a strange thing to say, but I miss the men I worked with, but I don't miss the job. I don't miss a phone ringing at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning saying to be there at 3 o'clock in the morning. I have got to see some of my friends a time or two since I've retired. I try to keep in contact with some of them. I talked to one fella a lot. He was my fireman for a good while. He's still trying to pick my brain of all the stuff I knew on the railroad. And I jokingly told him when he fired for me for over a year, and I told him that I taught you everything you know, but I didn't teach you everything I know. And but he's a great friend, and he and I keep in contact rather closely. After retirement, my wife and I built us a house out in the country, and we lived in it for about two and a half years. And it got to the point where 30-mile round trip for a gallon of milk just wasn't getting it. So we sold the house, and the whole story in that by itself, we put it on the market one day and it was sold the next day. And we moved into town, and we have enjoyed each other's company. We're in town and we're able to do things, and we're close to our doctor's offices or the movie, theater. But the pandemic has put a hold on all of the stuff that we could do in here. But we still have done a few things and have enjoyed each other's company. But the railroad, I just don't miss it at all. So I have been able to take more pictures. I got me a good camera and I've taken a lot of pictures with my camera, and enjoyed doing things with it, being outside, taking pictures of the fall and the spring, and have done some fishing, walks in the woods. I like to shoot guns, and just generally enjoy life in the state of West Virginia.
So you talked about you liked photography, and you've been doing photography for 40 years. Did you use railroads as sort of impetus for that, or was your subject matter more nature, like what you were saying, the scenery?
I would take the camera, occasionally I would take the camera on the train with me if I knew I was going to be in daylight. And I might never take a picture of an engine. But all the cameras that I have had, I could take a picture off of a moving locomotive, like an old barn or something like that. We would run at places we ran for miles, that there was no houses, it would be in a wilderness area, and it might take a picture of if somebody was off switching out, placing a mine or something like that, and I caught one of them acting stupid, and had my camera, I might take a picture of them and dare them that I was going to show it to somebody, just out of honoriness. But it gave me a chance to take pictures of the bridge that caught on fire. I had a picture of it before it caught on fire that was coming out of a tunnel, and I was sitting in the front seat of an engine, and I just picked the camera up, and when you came out of the tunnel, you had about 100 feet before you were out onto this bridge over the backwaters of the Elk River Dam. And just stuff like that, just something to grab my imagination and take pictures of.
All right. Were there any other stories? You showed me a couple of different pictures of trains in Elkins. Were they all trains in Elkins, or were they other things besides the bridge that you just told me about?
There's a picture of my father and I at the old station at Belington that is long gone. It's been torn down. The other picture that the other pictures that I have, one of them is of the train getting ready to leave Elkins, the passenger train. And then the picture, the reason I like it so well, in the picture is a picture of my mother, who has passed away. But my father is 95 years old and still alive. He's in a nursing home here in Elkins. I called him today and told him what I was going to do with the Railroad Museum. And he said, "You have a lot of tales to tell." And I said, "Well, I don't know how many I have to tell, but there are several that are in my mind." He told me, "Now, you tell them about the flood of '85. And I guess I have forgot to tell that, but we were going from Grafton to Callan when the flood of 1985 started, and we left out of Grafton, and they still had telegraph operators along the way. And the telegraph operator at Berryburg said, "Don't waste any time. The water is already over the road, over the bridge it was a highway bridge at Belington, and the water is coming quickly down the Taggart Valley River." Well, when we left out of there, on the way, we went through Philippi, and the only thing you could see, the water was up so high in Philippi that the only thing you could see was the end of the cross ties. The rest of it was water all the way around you on both sides of the track. So you didn't know if the water had washed the railroad away or anything like that. Well, we went on up the road a little bit farther. The dispatcher on the radio yelled at us, said, "Take some of your cars and set them off," which is you make a cut on the train and you pull ahead and you shove cars back into a siding. We set so many cars off at Taggart Junction, and that's where the Taggart River and the Buckhannon River come together. Well, when I went across the bridge, the water that was coming down the Taggart River from Belington was just hitting the bottom of the beams, the big girder beams that went across for the bridge. We set the cars off, coupled back up to the train, and we had to pump up the air on the train, which means that you have to get air in the cylinders to where the brakes will release. Well, the air started releasing. When I started pulling away, the water was up halfway or better on those same I-beams in less than 30 minutes, and the bridge was shaking. We took the train across the bridge and made it across the bridge. We got to a little place called Smith Summit. We pulled the train in the siding. And then we went around and got the caboose. We went into Buchanan. And when we got into Buchanan, there was water all the way around the station. All the way, everywhere you looked was water. They still told us to go up to the siding called Upshur and take the train that was in Upshur out. When we got up to Upshur, on the way up to Upshur, the only thing I could see, I couldn't even see ties, all I could see was this much of the rail sticking out of the water. And we got up there and we couldn't take the train out because water was all the way up on the, halfway up on the wheels of the train. And we started back down towards Buchanan to go out to put our engines out at Smith Summit, what they told us to do. And the railroad was completely underwater. So what we had to do, we had to find the highest piece of ground we could find. And they got us, the track foreman got us off the train in his high rail equipment. And we spent 3 days in Buchanan waiting for the water to subside. It was not a pleasant time. We had one square block to walk on.
Doesn't sound like a pleasant time.
It wasn't. But it was, that's just some of the stuff that has happened to me on the railroad.
Mm-hmm.